Welcome back. Dis-Chem Pharmacies says it stands by an internal memo in which it placed a moratorium on the appointment of white staff in the company. Meanwhile, trade union Solidarity has sent a legal letter to Dis-Chem. Let's bring in Solidarity's Connie Mulder for more on this conversation. Mr. Mulder, good afternoon, and thank you for your time. So this memo is now in the public domain, and it would seem that Dis-Chem says they stand by it. One presumes that they stand by the contents and their reading of the need for the measures they are taking. What is your reaction as Solidarity?
Well, I think our first reading of the memo was one reaction of shock in terms of this is not in the spirit of employment equity. It directly flies in contravention of Article 15 of the Employment Equity Act, which states that there should be no absolute barrier that prohibits people from applying for a post. And there's a massive difference between saying we need to look at transformation targets, we need to include more people, versus saying we are not going to include one whole race group. We're going to completely exclude them. And that means that is where our problem lies. Is this is a hard quota system that Dis-Chem emphasizes. It's not employment equity targets. It's nothing along those lines. What makes us more angry actually is it's not even noble intent. It's just plain malicious compliance that Dis-Chem is looking at. They're doing this because they're afraid of a turnover, a financial turnover, instead of a staff turnover. And we were rightly contacted by our members that says they feel that this is discrimination. This is absolute discrimination based on race. And we've now first sent a legal letter to Dis-Chem to confirm that this policy is still in place. We received a letter back that stated that they retracted the letter, but then in news reports, suddenly they contravened their own lawyers and says, no, the memo is still in power, which means we need to get some clarity on that. And then we're looking at legal steps further. This is a legal fight that we fought several times in the past. The difference between absolute quotas, saying you cannot compete or you cannot even apply for a position based on race, versus saying we need to look at our employment equity targets and we want more representation.
Sure. I take the point you're making about malicious compliance in that further down in that memo, the CEO phrases it around the seriousness of the consequences that the company, as a JSE-listed company, could face if they were to be fined. But I'm just wondering, what is it about it that you say makes this measure not to be about affirmative action and employment equity? In simpler terms, what bars this company from taking action where it believes that it's not meeting its transformational targets?
So yes, in short, there is a massive difference between a transformational target and an absolute quota and an absolute barrier, meaning you cannot set a position and say only black people can apply for this position. That would be an absolute barrier, and it flies against Article 15.4 of the Employment Equity Act. It flies against the Constitution as well. It says this is absolute discrimination. So that means you can set aside a position and say that we would prefer a black candidate or an Indian candidate, brown candidate, white candidate to meet our targets, but we're not excluding people from actually applying for this position. Dis-Chem's memo does exactly that. It explicitly states we will not be appointing anyone of a certain racial group. And this is an absolute barrier saying you cannot even apply for this position. Do not try. We will not be doing this. It's a moratorium. And it's the difference between a target that a company aims for to achieve versus an absolute quota that says certain people who look a certain way just cannot apply for this job. And that is a fine nuance, but one that is very important in the application of the Employment Equity Act. We've gone to court in the past on this specific principle several times, and we've got good legal precedent that says you cannot exclude somebody from applying for a position because of their skin color. You can have preferred candidates, but you cannot have this hard quota system that we have at the moment. And for Dis-Chem in particular, this is a very high-risk maneuver for the simple reason they're now discriminating against people behind the counters, and what we're picking up from our members, from the public, is an extreme anger at this measure, which we think might actually lead to consumer action against them.
Just take that point a bit further. You think it might lead to consumer action against Dis-Chem? In what form? What form are you getting the sense that consumer action would take?
Well, we've seen several of our members stating quite simply, if you do not want people who look like me behind the counters, why do you want my money? And why would I then not go to another pharmacy? And I think this might have far-reaching consequences for Dis-Chem. for the simple reason people tend to just plain move now. They're angry at Dis-Chem with good reason. And Dis-Chem's strategy, which is doubling down on a crude racist memo, which explicitly excludes a whole racial group from any positions in the company. This is the impact of this, is one that has caused significant anger. And we can see that from our social media presence, the members on our social media, as well as our own members, who are expressing extreme dissatisfaction. Yeah. And then several have indicated that they will now be moving their business to another pharmacy.
Yeah. So for the avoidance of doubt and confusion then, Mr. Mulder, if Dis-Chem, and as you say, there's a bit of confusion as to whether they've retracted that memo or not, but if they were to retract that memo in its form now and replace it with a position that says Dis-Chem will endeavor to employ people from designated historically disadvantaged groupings, instead of saying, using words like moratorium. In fact, let me read it. It says, a moratorium is placed on the appointment of white individuals. If they were to do that switch, would they face no problems from your side?
If they were to actually comply with the law, yes, then we would obviously we would welcome a change from an absolute barrier that prohibits people of a certain skill and color from applying for a position to trying to comply with BEE legislation and the Employment Equity Act. At the moment, we don't think they're complying. We think quite simply they're going way too far with an absolute quota system, and we will take legal action if they do not change this policy. From our perspective, we're actually quite disgusted with Dis-Chem, who would in a legal letter tell us that they have retracted the memo, and then we find out in news articles that they haven't. So we're first confirming if this policy is still in place and if it is still an absolute quota policy. And if that is, then we will most definitely be taking legal steps to force them into compliance with not only the Employment Equity Act, but also with the Constitution, which prohibits discrimination of this absolute kind based on race.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time and your insights. That's Connie Mulder there from the Trade Union Solidarity, weighing in on the controversy around a memo that was released within Dis-Chem itself that basically introduces a moratorium on the employment of white individuals. This is framed along the lines of our equity targets, our transformational targets, and triple BEE targets are not being met. And that memo coming from Ivan Saltzman, who is the CEO. It's gotten a lot of people talking about that situation.